and welcome to the third talk in Parkinson's Disease Foundation's sixth series of that we call the PD ExpertBriefings. Today our topic is the effects of exercise on PD, evidence, and the unanswered questions. Everybody's favorite topic, and one of the greatest ways, obviously, that individuals living with Parkinson's can control their own destiny and improve their own lives, which we see many, many times over. I'm delighted to tell you that we have an astonishing almost 1,200 people registered for this session, 25 countries and almost every state within the United States of America. So you'll excuse us while we have to be interrupted here by the fire alarm system at the PDF. This will only be a short digression, and you'll please forgive us, and we'll deal with the building afterwards. I'm pleased to announce that this series has been designed in collaboration with some very distinguished independent Parkinson's associations in the United States, the Houston Area Parkinson Society, the Michigan Parkinson Foundation, the Parkinson Association of the Rockies, and the Parkinson Association of the Carolinas. These four and a couple of others are part of a group that we call the Association of Independent Parkinson's Groups within the United States, and they're very strong patient advocacy, patient support groups, and they also support research. We're delighted to have them as partners. I'm also happy to say that another kind of partner, the kind that enables us to do this through the contributions they make, the AbbVie Corporation, has been our supporter and our sponsor for this series. We couldn't do it, of course, without AbbVie support. I also want to congratulate them. Nothing to do with this session today, but it happens to just yesterday, the Duopa, one of their products, was announced that it's been approved by the FDA. We wish them every good fortune with that for them and also for the Parkinson's community, who will benefit, we hope, by the access to this important new therapy. A little administrative piece here and there. A PowerPoint slide deck can be downloaded from the reminder email that you all should have received. If you registered, you would have received this this morning or very soon before that. Or you can download it from the PDF web page highlighting the talk. So you can go to www.pdf.org and find the talk there. Those of you who are qualifying, eligible, I guess is the word, professionals who are eligible to get CEUs, continuing education units, through the American Society on Aging, I want to remind you to our delight that we're able to offer one free CEU because of your participation in this course. If you registered as a health professional and indicated you'd like to have a CEU, you will receive an email by the end of this very day with steps on how you can collect this new credential. We wish you very well with that, and we're delighted to have that affiliation with the American Society on Aging. Now, with no further ado, I want to introduce our guest speaker. She's probably the most distinguished person in exercise and physical therapy who works with the Parkinson's community. Her name is Dr. Margaret Schenkman. She's at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, director of the physical therapy program there, and the associate dean for physical therapy education. I'm proud to say that our first association with Dr. Schenkman was now years ago. I think it was about 8 years ago, Margaret, and it was to look and see if there's a way in which PDF could help study the effect of exercise on the Parkinson's disease, on the progression of the disease, to see if there's a way in which one can measure the kind of impact that well-planned exercise can have upon the course of the condition for those who live with it. And so she was in on the very beginning of that, and she will, I understand in her introduction or in her slides, tell you a bit more about some of the things she's doing in the science of physical therapy and exercise in Parkinson's. I think I won't go into too much else about her. She's been with Parkinson's for 30 years. She has all sorts of credentials to her credit and associations with our community, and it's an enormous pleasure. I have to say it's one of a fairly long string now of really finding the leaders in these fields that we do for the expert briefings, and certainly Dr. Schenkman is carrying that banner and that baton with great distinction in her role, talking about this all-important matter of exercise in Parkinson's. So with great pleasure and pride, if I may say so, I introduce Dr. Schenkman to lead us in this session this afternoon. Dr. Schenkman.
Robin, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and I thank all of you who are here today for your interest in what we have been learning over the last 30 years. When I began this work, there was very little work on exercise in Parkinson's, and today there are exercise groups all over the country, I think all over the world, and it's really gratifying. So what I'm going to do today is it's not moving forward. The objectives today are to do three things. One is to understand the importance of exercise and activity for living well with Parkinson's disease. And I'm going to make a big point about exercise versus activity because they're actually similar but different. The second is to recognize current evidence and gaps in knowledge concerning exercise and activity benefits, and there are big gaps still, although there's also big knowledge. And then to come to the evidence that suggests that vigorous activity might, and I emphasize might, have a neuroprotective effect. So exercise versus activity. We're having trouble with the slides. My apologies. Just give me 1 second. Exercise refers to specific regimens, specific strategies that we use with underlying problems. For example, problems with gait, problems with balance, problems with strength, with flexibility. Exercise programs are often supervised and they're directed at specific underlying difficulties. Physical activity is, by definition, any movement of the body that uses energy. So when we walk, when we hike, when we garden, here in Colorado, we hike in the mountains, we backpack, we ski, and bicycle, a lot of bicycling here, all of that is physical activity. So which of these two is more important? It turns out that both are. Exercise helps to correct specific underlying difficulties that interfere with our daily activities and our daily function. Exercise, when it's directed to the right problems, can help to improve balance. It can help to improve specific strength deficits. It can help to improve specific flexibility problems. Activity, on the other hand, is what keeps you going. And so if someone engages in an exercise program, and often these are 2-week or 4-week or 4-month programs, it's necessary to keep moving and to keep active in order to maintain the gains and in order to enhance what you've learned. So activity, and particularly vigorous activity, is just as important as the structured exercise regimens that we have. And one of the things that I'll talk about today is that we have a lot of work now on what exercises are most beneficial. And now what we need to do is also figure out how to engage in activity to improve overall function. So let me take a few minutes and talk about some of the known losses associated with Parkinson's disease. And this goes back to the last 30 years of work, looking at losses of range of motion, especially in the neck and back, and the exercises that can help to improve range of motion, looking at losses of strength in people with Parkinson's disease, and looking at losses in cardiovascular condition. So in terms of range of motion, you have the next slide, which shows what's called functional axial rotation. That's a measure that we developed, almost 30 years ago, because of the awareness that people with Parkinson's disease have lost range of motion of the neck and back, and that becomes really important in causing problems with balance. So you can see in the bottom right-hand corner a gentleman who's trying to twist and turn. There's a little pointer on his head. When healthy people, say 40 to 59-year-old men, turn and twist, they twist to almost 120 degrees, and women to almost 130 degrees. But people with Parkinson's disease, if you look at the slides on the left, over time, over the course of the disease, lose range of motion. So that those with early-stage Parkinson's disease have pretty much the same range of motion as people typically, but by stage 2 of Hoehn-Yahr, or 25 to 30 of the UPDRS, that range of motion is dropping, so that by the time they're up in stages 2.5 and 3 of Hoehn-Yahr, there can be highly large losses in range of motion, say down to about 90 degrees. That makes it really hard to do things like turn to see behind when driving. It interferes with balance. It's a big problem. So range of motion, particularly of the neck and back, is a difficulty. The next impairment that I want to talk about is the impairments of strength. And it turns out that over a number of years, people have tried to figure out what are the strength issues associated with Parkinson's disease. And the literature was very confusing. But what we did is we got a group of people who were matched or comparable for age, gender, and body mass index, which is a kind of weight-height ratio. And we looked at people with Parkinson's disease and without Parkinson's disease. And we also looked at people who had milder Parkinson's disease, so less than 30 on the UPDRS, and more severe Parkinson's disease, greater than 30 on the motor part of the UPDRS. And what we found is that in the earlier stages of Parkinson's disease, there was really no difference between people with and without the disease. But in the later stages, the reduction in force production was as much as 50%. We also found that central activation, the ability of the nervous system to get that strength going, was reduced in people with more severe Parkinson's disease. And you can see a picture of this on the next slide, where you can see that the healthy people, comparable in age and gender and so on, and the people with low Parkinson's disease symptoms were pretty comparable, whereas the people with more severe Parkinson's disease actually had substantially reduced strength in the quadriceps. So this is all done with quadriceps, but we see similar findings in other muscle groups. So the next question is, what about aerobic capacity? And if you look at the next slide, what we have here is VO2 and speed of walking. And so the speed of walking has treadmill speeds from no speed to 4 miles per hour. And then the VO2 is how much oxygen is being used. And this is a measure that during walking can be called economy of movement. And if you look at the solid line, you can see that, look at the dashed line, you can see that the people without Parkinson's disease at all these speeds from 0 to 4 miles per hour are using less oxygen than the people with Parkinson's disease. And this is true of people even early in Parkinson's disease. So even very early in the disorder, it seems that people require more oxygen during activities, just simple activities of walking. And that seems to me to be potentially contributing to the fatigue that we observe with Parkinson's disease, although we haven't yet been able to look at that in great detail. But certainly it means that it's taking more energy and more effort. So what do we do about this? Well, it turns out that a lot of people over the last 20 years, myself included and our team, but people from a number of different institutions and universities, both in the U.S. and particularly in Australia and Great Britain, other places, the Netherlands, have been working hard on trying to figure out what does qualify as exercise and what would be helpful. Now, in 2012, there was a report from something called the Cochrane Collaborative. And this is a collaborative that reviews a lot of work across a long period of time and looks for work that's of particularly high quality to figure out what do we now know. And so in this Cochrane Collaborative, the scientists who reviewed the work looked at physiotherapy versus either a placebo or no intervention. And they found 39 studies that they thought were qualitatively good, and 1,518 participants overall. So these are studies from around the world, and 24 of them had what they called a quantitative synthesis. So they were able to do what's called a meta-analysis, where they take the results from these multiple studies and put them together and try to figure out what the data are showing. And what they concluded is that there are short-term benefits from any kind of exercise. The benefits were small, but they were of the size that they thought that people with Parkinson's disease would consider meaningful. Now, one of the things to remember when you look at exercise studies for people with Parkinson's disease is that this is, as we all know, a chronic progressive disorder. And so small benefits may actually be large in the sense that the disease progresses, and so if we can hold our own or even have small improvements, that's important. So let's look at what some of those findings, what some of the exercises were. So they looked at what they called general physical therapy versus not doing anything, or versus a control, rather. They looked at what they called exercise. So general physical therapy would be general programs. Exercise might be strength training, might be aerobic conditioning. Treadmill training, they looked at some of the treadmill training studies with and without auditory feedback. They looked at cueing, which is the auditory feedback of it. They looked at studies of dance, and they looked at studies that used martial arts. So Tai Chi, for example. And those were the kinds of studies that were among these studies that were considered of high enough quality to be included. And what they showed was that overall there were short-term improvements, and notice that word short-term, we'll come back to that in a minute, but there were short-term improvements in gait, the velocity, in other words, how fast people walked, step length, so how big the step is, and 2- and 6-minute walks. And those 2- and 6-minute walks are how far people can go in 2 minutes or how far they can go in 6 minutes, walking as fast as they can. They also found improvements in functional reach, which is a measure of balance, and it measures how far a person can reach forward in standing. Timed up and go, which is how long it takes to stand up, walk a certain distance, turn around, walk back, and sit down again. The Berg Balance Scale is a pretty typical scale of measuring balance. And then the UPDRS is that test that neurologists frequently will do, and also now other clinicians, to rate the disorder. They also said something really important. They said that the absence of evidence in all the other outcomes that were investigated in these many studies doesn't necessarily mean there's not a benefit, but it may be that there just weren't enough people participating yet to know what that benefit is. Now, in addition to the Cochrane review, which was all the studies up until 2012, there have been 4 big studies that included more people, as many as 100, and our study had 100 people in it. That's the flexibility study. There was an aerobic endurance study by Dr. Schulman, a neurologist, with about 60 people. There was resistance training by Dr. Korkus in Chicago with about 60 people, and Tai Chi by Dr. Lee. And these 5 studies had more people in them, and also 2 of them, the one that we conducted and the one that Dr. Korkus conducted, were longer-term studies. which is really important. These are the beginning of the studies to ask what happens over the long term, because we all know that just like taking L-DOPA, if you take it for a while and have benefit and were to stop taking it, the benefit would go away. And the same with exercise. If we exercise for a while and stop exercising, the benefit goes away. So our study of flexibility was designed to look at flexibility versus aerobic conditioning versus a general program. And what we found is that the flexibility training improved overall ability to function. But after the 4 months of structured intervention, it wasn't better than the other programs. The aerobic conditioning that we looked at actually had benefits out to 16 months, which is really important. Schulman's study also showed that aerobic endurance improves aerobic condition. Carcass's study, which went on for 2 years with training for 2 years, showed that the resistance training improved strength, and it also improved the UPDRS. And Tai Chi improved both strength and balance. So basically what we're learning is two things. One is that it takes ongoing exercise in order to retain the long-term benefits, and the long-term exercise habits are critical because of the chronic and progressive nature of Parkinson's disease. Secondly, we don't know, and I wish I could tell you, we don't know the exact appropriate exercise prescription, but what I can suggest is that, and what we do know, is that there's what's called specificity of training. If you train for balance, you're going to improve balance. If you train for strength, you'll improve strength. If you train for aerobic conditioning, you're going to improve aerobic conditioning. And so the right program probably for everybody depends on what are the underlying problems. Is it more a problem of flexibility, of strength, of balance, a combination? And based on knowing what the underlying difficulties are, one can figure out how to target the program. Now, I'm going to shift gears for a minute and talk about activity. So remember I said exercise are these very specific programs for strength, for balance, and so on. What we also know is that people with Parkinson's disease are generally less active than older adults that are of about the same age. So, for example, almost 700 people with Parkinson's disease were compared to almost 2,000 people without, and it was found that they were a third less active. And furthermore, activity declines as the disease severity increases, and that makes a lot of sense because it gets harder to get around. But what's concerning is that in a longitudinal study, so a study over a period of a year, what was found was that the number of daily steps that people took over that year was 12% less at the end of the year, and furthermore, the actual intensity of it was 40% less at the end of the year. Now, that's really concerning to me. And by the way, activity in these studies that I'm talking about predominantly were measured by having people wear step counters so that we would know how many steps they're taking. And those step counters, you can figure out how many of them are at low intensity or moderate intensity or high intensity if you get the right kind of step counter. So a 12% decline in number of steps and a 40% decline in how much intensity is in moderate intensity steps is of great concern. Now, we're just beginning to understand activity and how to think about helping people to keep themselves active and improve activity. And so the next set of slides that I'm going to talk about are from the studies in the Netherlands, the ParkFit trial, which is one of the only studies so far to really look at activity. The ParkFit trial was a 2-year study that compared physical therapy that had a specific emphasis on promoting an active lifestyle, and that was called the ParkFit program, to a general physical therapy program called the ParkSafe program. And what's important is that the ParkFit trial included goal setting, some help on trying to overcome barriers that keep people from exercising, some help with social support and coaching, and then using activity monitors as well as visual feedback to figure out daily activity levels and to help people to become more active. And what they were looking for was a lasting change in exercise behaviors. And this is what they found out. They found out that the people in the ParkFit compared to the ParkSafe had over a 14-day physical activity count, had 90 minutes of more activity per week compared to the increased 90 minutes compared to the ParkSafe, who only increased 30 minutes. So that's an hour more of activity a week in the ParkFit trial. They also found that the walking endurance, so using the 6-minute walk test, how far can you walk in 6 minutes, was greater after 2 years, after 24 months, for the ParkFit people. So it does suggest that we can help people to improve their activity. The bottom line is that regular activity is important. If a person is sedentary, just getting up and moving is helpful. If a person is already active, then begin to build up to regular, more vigorous activity. And this takes time. I personally started wearing a step counter about 8 years ago and found out I wasn't walking very much. I wear it all the time now, and I try to walk at least 10,000 steps a day, which is the recommended amount of walking for healthy living. And when I don't wear my step counter, I very quickly revert to 3,000 steps a day. So it takes being aware, but and I also should say that I built up to it slowly. I didn't go from not walking much to 10,000 steps a day in a couple of weeks. It took time. So the bottom line is build up activity. Now, one of the big questions is vigorous activity important? And I think there's a lot of awareness now of the importance of vigorous activity. We know that midlife regular exercise reduces the risk of Parkinson's disease down the road. So in the middle of life, to be exercising vigorously was associated, and this is by looking at retrospective at previous data in big data sets, that there was less risk of Parkinson's disease in those who were active. We also know that exercise can reduce impairments in cognition in older people, whether or not with or without dementia. And there are animal models of Parkinson's disease that suggest that physical exercise can help with brain plasticity. So one of the studies that I think got all of us very excited was the work with Tandem biking that compared forced pedaling at a high rate versus a self-selected rate. And there were 10 people that were randomly assigned, either they were on the forced pedaling or on the self-selected rate. And they had 3 sessions of an hour each for 10 weeks. And what was found is that those who were doing the forced pedaling had really remarkable improvements in their UPDRS scores. Now, this was a small study, and we need large studies, but it certainly raised the question of whether exercise is actually neuroprotective. And so we need to have those kinds of studies, and this is one of the questions that we were talking about 8 years ago with Robin when we were discussing what we could do to begin to study whether vigorous activity in people with Parkinson's is actually neuroprotective. And it turns out that in order to ask that question, we really need to first understand the best dose of exercise. And so what we did is set out to look at how vigorously do people need to exercise in order to see symptom improvements? And particularly to look at that in people who have not yet begun to take dopaminergic or other dopamine-related therapies, because once people are on drug therapies, it's very hard to figure out what's the drug therapy and what's the exercise. So what we've done is we have a multi-center study going on, which is, and the reason it's multi-center is because it's not easy to find people not yet on medications. And then of those who are not yet on medications, many of them would much prefer to be in a study of medication because it's easier. But what we want to know is, does exercise slow Parkinson's symptoms? And so at the University of Colorado, the University of Pittsburgh, and Northwestern University, we have 3 different sites where we're working with people to ask that question. So this is called the SPARKS study of Parkinson's disease and exercise. It's designed to figure out the right intensity, and we're comparing aerobic conditioning exercises at 2 intensities to not doing anything for 6 months. And we expect to complete this study next year with 126 participants. And right now, what I can tell you is that we have, and I should mention that we're comparing 60 to 65% of heart rate max, so the heart rate for a person adjusted for their age, versus 80 to 85%, which is pretty vigorous, versus waiting. And people are exercising 4 times a week for 6 months, and then they can continue to exercise for up to a year with us. And I am very happy to tell you that right now, actually, on this slide it says 97 participants are randomized, that as of today there are 98, and you can see that 61, about half of them have completed 6 months, and so far what's really exciting is that only 2 people withdrew before 6 months. So that tells me that people can exercise 4 times a week or somewhere in that range, and they stay in the study, and that's great because it gives me the confidence that with help, people can exercise quite a bit. So what I want to do now, so that's where we are so far with 3 things. One, the first thing we talked about is what kinds of exercises, and it turns out that all kinds of exercises can lead to benefits, various ones. So it's possible that people can adjust their exercise to what works for them and what they enjoy. The second is that if there are specific underlying problems, it might be important to address exercises, have exercises that address those problems, whether it's strength or balance or flexibility or aerobic conditioning. The third is that staying active is just as important and critical if one begins an exercise program to build into more general activity. And the fourth is that vigorous activity probably is also important. We just don't know how vigorous yet, but we hope to have that answer in the next year or so. So looking at exercise and activity across stages of Parkinson's disease, these are some of the recommendations that I have now based on what I've learned over the last, 30 years. First of all, for people in early stages of Parkinson's disease, it's really important to live an active lifestyle, to continue involvement in as much as possible at home, at work, and in leisure activities. And it's important to engage in activities that are fun, activities that one will keep up, whether it's dancing or hiking or biking or just walking with friends or spouses. It's important that those activities, if possible, can challenge balance and aerobic conditioning and the ability to do multiple tasks at the same time. In thinking about exercise, think about prevention. Think about preventing falls through treating strength, flexibility, aerobic conditioning. It would be good to begin a general exercise program early. to just tune everything up and then periodically go back and check with a physical therapist. Is that exercise program working? Do I need to reinitiate it for 3 or 4 months and then go back to activities, or at the same time do activities, rather, but periodically retune with a general exercise program. If one can only do one thing, one kind of exercise, then I think aerobic exercise is what I would recommend, and that means at somewhere between 65% and 80% of max heart rate. But activity, stay active. In the middle stages of Parkinson's disease, the things that are important are stay active. Activity, vigorous activity that's fun and safe, same thing. Walking programs, regular dance, kickboxing has become big. In terms of exercise, it's important to review the underlying problems with a professional, a physical therapist, for example, and really target those impairments, those underlying problems that are most problematic. The other thing that becomes important in the middle stages of Parkinson's disease is to reduce multitasking. So it becomes harder and harder to do two things at the same time, and that's a prescription for falls. And so for daily living, to be aware of when to not try to do two things at the same time. By later stages of Parkinson's disease, activity is still important, but being active within what one can do. So it may not be possible to do 10,000 steps a day, but it is possible to get up and get one's own medication rather than asking a spouse, for example. It's important to engage in activities that can keep one moving to the extent possible. And it turns out, there's very little information yet, but there's a little bit that suggests that even in later stages of Parkinson's disease, for people who are still walking, it may be possible to improve balance. We need more information about what are the best approaches to exercise in later stages of Parkinson's disease, but we do know that throughout all stages, the more active one can be, the better. Now, one of the unresolved issues and unsolved issues, and this is true whether one has Parkinson's disease or is just getting older or any other disorder, is how do we adhere to an ongoing program of exercise and activity? And one of the things that we're beginning to try to work on now also is what kinds of support do people need in the community? We know what happens in the laboratory setting now when people come into the clinic and participate in these really well-designed exercise studies, but how can we take that information and make it meaningful to people at large? And there are a number of us that are now beginning to try to ask and answer that question. And I think it's going to be a combination of exercise and activity, and it's going to take us some more years. But I think we know enough at this point to know that the kinds of guidelines that I just mentioned are where we need to start. I wouldn't have been able to do this work that I just talked with you about without all the people who've worked with us over many, many, many years. And people with Parkinson's disease have been fabulous collaborators, and funding from the National Institutes of Health, from the Davis Phinney Foundation, and I'm grateful to all of that support. So I thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schenkman. That was just terrific, and it just reminded me, having been in this field now for a number of years, how much more science we have in this area of exercise than we ever had before, and so much of that is because of the work of you and your colleagues and the leadership of the movement, and we're very grateful for all this, and it's great to hear you talk about some of it and see how far it's progressed. A couple of reminders on how we manage this program. For the Q&A, for those of you who are listening via the internet, all you have to do is click the text box, enter your question there, and then click the send button. we'll have your question then. I'm afraid we won't have time. I'm looking at the clock now. Dr. Schenkman ended absolutely on time, but she does have to leave at the 20 minutes, and we probably won't be able to get to all the questions at that point. So if you find that we haven't answered your question, or we haven't had a chance to ask her your question, then do take advantage of our helpline, which many of you, I'm sure, know and use, I hope, 1-800-457-6676. And we have very well generally educated young women there who will help you answer your question. And if they can't answer it, they know where to go and find the answers. So please make use of that. I've got some interesting questions. First of all, we have an interesting number of professionals on this call. We always have some. But it's interesting how something that sounds intuitively so much within the patient's control also has a great deal of interest among the doctors and the physical therapists and other professionals who work in this area. So I'm going to leave some of those to the end. A couple of them are rather rarefied questions, and I'm going to take some of the more obviously popular ones first, if I may. Here is an interesting point that both raised by a professional from Luxembourg in Western Europe, and also by a patient in California. And it has to do with not so much is there enough exercise that we're doing, but the professional from Luxembourg is asking, how far can I push my patients? Is there a point at which I should stop pushing them because the too much is too much? And the California question is very, very similar. I'm exhausted by the end of the day. I need to be constantly moving because this is what keeps me balanced during the day, and I'm exhausted at the end. Is there such a thing as too much exercise? So could you just give us a little bit more interpretation about the other limit, at the other end of the scale, when people are doing too much? They need to be aware of that. Is it not good for the Parkinson's? Is it something that you have some scientific or just intuitive answer to, Dr. Schenkman?
I don't have the scientific answer to the question, but I have the intuitive answer. And I also answer it as someone who's getting older and push myself and realize that when I exercise hard, I'm aware of it. But at the same time, what we've learned from the science so far is that we've probably under-exercised with people with Parkinson's for a long time. I remember when I started this work, people were afraid that aerobic conditioning might mess up the medications. Not true. There were studies to look at that, and it did not interfere with the L-DOPA absorptions. What I now recommend is appropriately, vigorously, 3 times a week, to the extent that one can. And again, build up with a professional so that you're building up and not hurting yourself. But if you can exercise vigorously 3 times a week, whether weight training, aerobic conditioning, dancing, you may be a little less active that day, but in the long run, you need to have enough intensity for it to make a difference. So it is an issue of working with a professional to figure out what is that right point for you so that you're not overdoing it, but it's important to not underdo it.
Great. Thank you very much. We have a question from Prince Edward Island in Canada and another from Rochester in the state of New York in the United States, which deal with specific exercises for particular problems with Parkinson's. The Canadian question is, are there particular exercises to prevent the tendency to lean forward in Parkinson's? And the question from Rochester, New York, is, are there any exercises that would be helping with digestive problems and constipation? On either or both of those, is there anything any wisdom you'd share on exercises that might help?
With regard to leaning forward, one of the reasons that I began working on flexibility of the trunk, the torso, the middle part of the body, some 30 years ago, is because I realized that the leaning forward is partly from losing range of motion of the muscles that pull us forward. And it turns out that people who get on a good flexibility program early and retain that flexibility program, really working on the torso, can retain flexibility and upright posture for a long, long time. Now, there is a leaning forward in Parkinson's that's beyond that. which is for people who will just be sitting and then they are pulled into a forward position really quickly. I've not found a good solution to that problem yet. In terms of the digestive issue, but it is still really important, just sticking with that a minute, to maintain that flexibility of the middle part of the body, the trunk, the back, the pelvis. Because even just in terms of being able to get up, get down, turn over in bed, having the range of motion is really important. In terms of digestion, I've not seen any data, and I don't have any data about changes in digestive and problems. But I think it's an important question and one that we should try to find the answer to.
Great, thank you. We have a pair of questions, one from California and the other from a caregiver in Texas, which deal with the way in which, or the context in which we do our exercise as people with Parkinson's. From California, the question is supervised exercise, is there evidence to show that supervised exercise is as good as or better than simply serious, frequent, independent exercise just by yourself? And then from Texas, a variant on the same kind of question, is it better, in your view, Dr. Schenkman, to do your exercise in a group as opposed to the solitary setting?
I love that question because the answer is it depends. What I've learned, and we've done a little bit, we actually followed up with people after they were in our 16-month study. We followed up a year or two later to see what they were doing. And all of them said they were more active than before they began the study, but on average, they weren't as active as when they were having supervision. Now, in our current study, we have some people who are just so active that they don't qualify to be in the study because they're active on their own. So the it depends is how
is a resource manual. What do we call that?
Pardon? Is how disciplined a person is. If one is disciplined and can get going on one's own or can get on a program and then keep going on one's own, that's the best. That's terrific because ultimately you don't want to have someone with you all the time. In terms of group versus individual, I've worked with people who prefer to exercise in a group. I've worked with people who prefer to exercise by themselves. So it really, again, is a personal preference. What I would say is whatever works is what one should do.
Sounds like very good advice. Thank you. There's several questions when I'm going to sort of put them all together, and they have to do with where you go to find tools, techniques, ideas beyond listening to this terrific talk by Dr. Schenkman, which doesn't happen every day or every week, and even she couldn't cover the whole thing in just 40 minutes. So do you have any suggestions of resources? While you're thinking about that, I should point out that we have PDF among the materials that we provide for people with Parkinson's. We have, if you haven't seen it, a rather elegantly produced and a very useful, people have told us that it's terrifically useful, Parkinson's disease resource list, which includes exercise and the things that it talks about. And we also have a helpline, which I think I referred to earlier, if you want particular tips. And you reach that by calling 1-800-457-6676. But having mentioned those two PDF resources, are there areas, are there resources that you have, that you use, that you advise people to use, Dr. Schenkman, if they want to extend this further and do the 202 or 303 course, having had the 101 course from you today?
You know, I don't have those tools right now. I do know that your foundation, the Davis Phinney Foundation, the Michael J. Fox Foundation, there are a lot of foundations that are beginning to put those kinds of tools together, but I don't have any specifically of my own.
Good, and thank you for mentioning those because we're not the only fish in the pond. We like to think we do what we do very well, but there are these other resources, and in fact the Davis Phinney Foundation has done a great deal to raise the profile of the need for exercise, and Michael J. Fox too. So thank you for those references. That's very helpful. See now, what else do we have here? There's a question from California, which was partly answered by you, I think, but it's interesting to me, and I'd like to hear the answer to this, so I'm going to ask it maybe kind of a second time. The question is the long-term benefits of exercise. You mentioned in your talk that if you stop doing exercise, the benefits go away. Does that, how you relate that point, which was very clearly made, and I'm sure everybody got that, to when you are doing it continuously, whether there's some kind of a long-term benefit built in, or whether there's even some way in which it may, I realize this is a very, probably a controversial issue, whether it may actually slow the development of Parkinson's in some way or make it easier to live with Parkinson's over the long term.
I can give you an answer to that both from my anecdotal observations of people that I've worked with over years and from a little bit from our studies. So from observation, people who are exercising and exercise regularly over long periods of time seem to do better than people who don't, just functionally and overall. And neurologists that I work with can tell me which of their patients are exercising. They can just tell because they're not progressing as fast. That's anecdotal. The other thing is that when we did our study looking at flexibility versus aerobic conditioning versus general exercise on one's own, what we found is that after 2 years, or after 16 months, the people that were doing aerobic conditioning had improved in their walking economy, that's that use of oxygen, to the point where they were very close to what healthy people without Parkinson's disease. And that was over a 2-year period, only the first 4 months of which were supervised exercise. So it looks like there are some data that suggest that you really can make long-term improvements in sustained function. We need more data in that regard, but certainly that's what it appears. That's my impression. I think there was another part to that question that I lost. Did I miss something?
Well, no, I think you've answered it. It was really just about long-term benefits, and
yeah. And there is an important point. So it may be that a 4-month supervised exercise program, for example, gets one fit enough that one doesn't have to keep doing those exercises, but if one then engages in regular activity of a vigorous enough nature, then one can sustain the benefits. And then maybe in 6 months or a year, do a tune-up, do some exercise again, and then go back to activities that one likes. Because it gets hard to do structured exercise for years on end. But being very active may be the solution.
Thank you very much. This next question is, I thought it was from a professional. Then I realized, since we know the person, that it's just one of those people who PDF is very proud to have in our research advocacy program who always sound like professionals. And so it's partly because I'm insistent upon promoting good things that we do on occasion when it's appropriate, and partly because I know this person and she always asks good questions. I'm going to ask this one, even though it sounds very much PhD-ish. She is asking, a recent paper that she had read highlighted that high-cadence bicycling increased GDNF, the growth factor, in the brain. Are you familiar with this, Dr. Schenkman, and can you explain why, if that's so, that can be important in Parkinson's? Does that ring a bell to you, this high-cadence cycling and GDNF?
I've missed that paper, so I'm going to have to go look for it. And that's actually very exciting, and it's one of the things that we all need to get to.
Excellent.
Is to look at so GNF, the growth nerve factor in the brain, indicates that the brain is actually maybe is a surrogate for some kind of plasticity or improvement, and may be related to why this vigorous activity helps with cognition, with aging well, and maybe with protecting from Parkinson's. But
excellent.
That's where we need to go in our studies, and that's another whole area that colleagues and I are looking at moving into.
That's great. Anyway, I'm going to out her. Her name is Nan Little. She comes from the state of Washington. She's a terrific person, and we're going to make sure that she gives you the citation for the article. I'm sure she'll be very happy to do that. Thank you, Nan, for a nice testing question. We always like to test our nice guests, and they always seem to do so well. I've got a question here about falls. This is a person with Parkinson's who lives in Boulder, Colorado. And she's saying, she's a person also in the professional area, that many of us professionals have had success in teaching prevention of falls. And she's asking, do you know of any successes teaching the reflexes to minimize damage from a fall? Like, for example, the example she uses, like the martial arts. Is there any way to not only prevent falls, but teaching the reflexes that will minimize the damage when a fall occurs?
That's a good question, and it's one that I think has two answers. With Parkinson's disease, over time, the automatic reflex is simply diminishes. And so, for example, when people begin to fall, they don't catch themselves. I don't know that one can teach the reflex at that point. And people who have, for example, if you pull them posteriorly and they just timber over on you, no response, I don't think that you can teach the reflex. However, a lot of people fall not because the reflex isn't there, but because they don't have the flexibility and they don't have the strength anymore. And so by improving flexibility and strength and coordination, it may be possible to help those people to prevent the damage from falls.
Great. Thank you very much. Very thoughtful answer. I think we have time just for one more question. I'm very cognizant of your own timeline. And as I said, I'm afraid we won't get to answer all of these questions, much to my regret. But this next one actually comes from somebody within the PDF, but I know why she's asking it. I just can't resist passing it on to you. We get calls the whole time from people saying, it's a great talk from Dr. Schenkman. Will my physical therapist know the stuff that she knows? Or is this just something you only get when you're a very distinguished scientist at the University of Colorado? So the question is a real one for those of us who are referring people and for those who ask us for referrals. In your view, Dr. Schenkman, knowing the field very well as you do most physical therapists who say that they know Parkinson's know most things that you've talked about, and is there any kind of caveat emptor, any kind of a warning, or, putting it more positively, a place that a person can go to make sure they're getting a physical therapist who really knows the business, Parkinson's being a rather specialized business, and not everybody will know it. So do you have any advice for somebody going into the market trying to get the best person for Parkinson's who's not you?
Oh boy, that's a hard one. It's sort of like, does every surgeon, do you want to go to any surgeon, or do you want to go to the best surgeon? Do you want to go to any cardiologist, or do you want to go to the one with the best results? And physical therapists are the same. There are physical therapists who are superb at working with people with Parkinson's. There are physical therapists who are very good at working with people with Parkinson's, and there are physical therapists who haven't had a lot of experience because it is fairly specialized. And it's a dilemma. It's one of the things that we're working on actually right now through the American Physical Therapy Association is a series of a course on helping people with Parkinson's disease to be taken nationally, because we do need to get this information out. There are a lot. I think the best is to try to find out what kind of experience the person has, where they got their experience, and what kind of successes they've had.
Good advice.
I wish I could give a better answer.
Well, it's a good one. It's a hard question and a good answer. Thank you very much, and thank you for everything else you've done for us today. Just to complete our hour, pretty much on time, I want to remind you, of those of you who've not been on these calls before, we would really appreciate it if you would complete our online survey. It should be on your screen right now. Your feedback helps us in all kinds of ways, and you may already have noticed, those of you who are regulars, that we use the feedback, particularly on content that wasn't covered or could be covered or questions that could be asked. We use it centrally in planning each year's series. So in addition to helping us make the next ones even better than what we've done to date. So please do answer that webinar questionnaire, and you can be sure that it'll be time well spent and information well used by us. I also want to thank AbbVie once again, the AbbVie Corporation, for making this whole series possible. We're very grateful to them for their help, which is indispensable. These things, of course, cost money, and we're delighted to have partners who can help us with that piece of it. We have an archive of the event, which will be available starting a week from now, following our usual custom, Tuesday, January the 20th. You can access it at that point by dialing into www.pdf.org. We'll send you an email with the link when it's available, so you can listen to the talk again, or of course you can let your friends know about it, anybody else you want to know about it, including your doctor perhaps, who wants to know more about exercise. Who knows? So please take advantage of that. It's going to be up a week from now. I also want to advertise the next session in our series of expert briefings. It'll be on Tuesday, March 3rd, and it'll be from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern U.S. time, as usual. And the topic is going to be more than meets the eye, vision symptoms of PD. I will be led in this session by Dr. Daniel Gold. He's a doctor of ophthalmology, and is an assistant professor of neurology and assistant professor of ophthalmology at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. We do try, as those of you who are regulars know, to not only go down the already beaten path of such generally interesting and always interesting subjects like exercise. We try to go into some of the narrower areas that are not very well covered by other educational experiences. And to my knowledge, this is certainly the first time PDF has done something just focusing on the vision symptoms of PD. And I think that any of you who have any remote interest in this will find this a very good and very useful session. So this having been said, I want to thank all of you for participating, and those of you who will be participating over the next few weeks. I want to particularly thank Dr. Schenkman for this outstanding talk. Those of you who did not get to have your questions answered, I think the most expeditious way to do this is for you to call into our helpline, and you'll find two terrific people there who will help you best they can. And if it's too difficult a question, and I did mention the professionals, I must apologize to them because there are 3 or 4 MDs and high-level medically trained people whose questions we did not get to, partly because they were a little bit on the sort of high-minded side, and I thought we could handle them perhaps a little better in person. So we'll try to get back to you, doctors, and et cetera. And for those others who were not able to have their questions answered, please be in touch with our helpline, and you'll get whatever we can provide through that as quickly and promptly, as accurately as possible. Once again, thanks again for participating in this session today. Thank you, Dr. Schenkman, and have a great week, all of you, and we'll be talking to you in what will be the Northern Hemisphere spring, or at least the beginning of it. Good luck with the next few weeks, and we'll hear from you soon. Bye-bye.